Alright, so I recorded this video once already, but I forgot that I didn't have a background, and I had no background, so it was just literally nothing but my camera and the left side over here. So I have to record it. But that's just me piddle paddling around. Let's talk about Parry. Parry is a mechanic that has been in the game since day one, 2004 Vanilla WoW, and it has been very important since day one. Parry has been a staple not only in this video game, but has been a staple in life itself since the Dark Ages as a technique. Parry is integral to how the game functions. It was integral to how Classic functions. It was something that just made sense in the world, right? Now, why was Parry important in Classic WoW? What did it do? How did it work? In Classic WoW, you had what was a stat called weapon skill. And what weapon skill was, is it was your weapon skill, like if this was a mace, how good am I with my mace against your defenses and against enemies of similar skill? And if you were good with your weapon, because you had to train all your weapons individually, your defense bad, my weapon good, bonk. Hit, totally fine, right? However, there are different mechanics that come with weapon skill and come with the melee class in general. First, we have parry. Let's say the boss is looking at you. Actually, no, we'll save parry for last, because there's certain mechanics that go with it. Let's talk about dodges. You attack at a mob, and it goes out of the way. Huh. Well, the mobs can dodge, right? So the mobs will dodge, or the mobs can... Or you are terrible, the mob is here, and you just miss. Completely fucking miss. You can miss, they can block your hit with a shield if they have got a shield. They can parry it, they can dodge it. There's also a stat that was very important called an ability called glancing blows. Not an ability, but something that happened. Where if their defense is high, but you still have ample attack skill with your weapon skill, like you're good with your weapon, you would still hit, but you wouldn't get really through their armor. So you would hit, and it would glance off. It was called a glancing blow. You didn't get the full damage in. It would go, bah, right? So you wouldn't get the full damage, but you would still hit. So melee dealt with glancing blow, missing, dodging, blocking, and then parry. Now, parry was of special importance, not only because it was a 5% chance that you would just simply do no damage, right? Because melee auto attacks were so important in Vanilla WoW. There's a mechanic called parry hasting that does not currently exist anymore. But essentially what happened is if a boss or an enemy parried your attack, its next melee swing would be faster. I don't know exactly how much faster, but if it parried, its next swing would be faster. That's just how it worked. That's how it worked for players. That's how it worked for bosses. So, if you were fighting the boss, and you had 40 people, 20 of which were all melee, standing in front of the boss, you were parry hasting the boss so much that the boss was smashing your tank into the dirt, right? Your tank literally could not survive because of the amount of parry hasting happening, meaning the boss would just attack over and over and over again because of how much haste it was getting from that. So, obviously, the tactics developed. You no longer stood in front of the boss, you stood behind the boss. So now all you dealt with was dodging and glancing blows. You did not have to, or missing. You did not deal with the boss parrying you because you were behind him. So from the start of the game, being behind the boss is good. You were also fighting dragons, so obviously breath attacks made being behind the boss, being in front of the boss, very dangerous, but dragons also have a tail whip. So being behind the boss specifically was also a detriment. So you wanted to stay not in front or behind, but almost at like the flank of a boss where you're not getting hit by the tail, you're not being hit by the frontal, and that's where your position is, almost near the back right leg, generally, of these bosses. So you weren't killing your tank, your damage was you were doing as much damage as possible, and that's how melee evolved. Now, what about physical ranged? Physical range dealt with weapon skill a bit differently. Quite literally, you either hit the mob, or you missed. That was it. Physical ranged attacks did not deal with parry at all. Didn't deal with parry, didn't deal with glancing blows. They could still be dodged or missed, but you're essentially going to hit the target and do full damage with a piercing attack, right? Or the piercing attack would not work, and it would be considered a miss, what would consider to be a glancing blow. You just miss, because obviously you're not doing damage if you're not piercing that mob. So, that's what range dealt with. But what did casters deal with? Casters dealt with an entirely different system that was kind of like our melee parry system, right? The glancing blows, dodge, block, parry, all that stuff. The casters actually had an equivalent to it, which was you would miss your attacks, your spells would be partially resisted, full resisted. Actually, I think it was just those. Partial resist, full resist, and your attacks missing. So what are those? Every boss in the game originally had a resistance stat tied to it. That's why in Phase 1 of Classic WoW, you're going into Molten Core. When you're fighting a bunch of Fire Lords and Fire Giants, you're not really going to hit them with a Fireball and expect anything to happen, because their resistances were very high. To fire, because they are fire. That is why people played Frost, because their resistance to frost damage as a fire mob was way lower. On top of a spell called Curse of the Elements from Warlocks, which lowered your resistance, there was also, I don't know if it's called Winter's Bite or what exactly it was called, but there was another spell, another talent point that mages could take that would increase the amount of frost damage the enemy would take. Generally, only one mage would take it, so the rest could benefit from it. But all in all, mages or casters altogether dealt with this system in their own way, where they had their own variation of dodge, parry, block with these partial, full, and missing on the resist, right? So how did players counteract this? Well, they had a stat in the game called hit rating. If you were dual wielding, you would hit less. If you had no hit rating, you would hit less. So essentially, you were building your character around doing as much damage you can to hit the boss as much as you can, which means that you had gear with hit rating on it. Casters had gear with hit rating on it. And your position mattered, so you weren't doing parry, weren't parry hasting the boss, etc., etc. Moving on to TBC, they didn't remove any of this, but they actually added a new stat called Expertise, specifically for melee characters. Expertise was a stat that made the ability for the boss or the enemy you were fighting to parry, dodge, or block your attack significantly reduced. So at a certain number of expertise, essentially, the boss could never dodge your attacks, and you could only potentially miss your attacks if you didn't have enough hit rating. So your characters were built around this hit rating and this expertise number more so than anything else, and it was boring. And people didn't like it. So as an example, I will bring up this. This was a note from the developers. Expertise was removed in patch 6.0.2 along with hit rating. The developers described the process of reaching the expertise and hit caps as a penalty rather than an augmentation. They want your stats to matter, to be fun. But a stat that you just have this much of this, have this much of this, any more, like if you had over the expertise cap, it didn't give you anything. There was nothing of value to it. If you had under, you were just losing out on damage. Same thing with hit rating. So they're like, you know what? Hit rating, expertise, while effective, just not fun from the game. It's like, right? It's not fun. So as we move forward from this into the modern version of WoW, a lot of things has changed, right? Resistances don't matter anymore. You can hit any boss with anything. In terms of being blocked or dodging, your bosses aren't dodging if you're hitting them from behind. They changed the mechanic where if you're hitting someone from behind, they can't dodge you. Same thing with parry. You can't parry something from behind you. It has to be in front of you. To make the game more consistent. So leading into where we are now, of all of those systems I talked about and their legacy and what they did and how they affected and made and curled the game up, all that's left is parry. Parry is the only thing left outside of dodging in this system, and it has very negative connotations and potential to completely ruin how you play a fight, depending on what the boss does. Now let me give you an example here, right? For our current Fury tier set, when we use Odin's Fury, we get a stack of this buff. If we Bloodthirst and the boss parries us, It does not remove a stack of the buff because you did not hit with it. However, because we're running Reckless Abandon, if you have this as Bloodbath and you cast it, your Bloodbath will go away. You will keep the stack from the tier set bonus, but you will do no damage and will be forced to re-rampage. Now, that's not that big of a deal, but there are further connotations to this where we have to consider, well, what should and what shouldn't be parried. And first and foremost, you think, well, who's always in front of the boss? And that is the tanks. The tanks are always in front of the boss. So, because of that, here are logs from Mythic Smolderon. And you'll notice warriors have no mischance at all. Nothing can be missed. Demon Hunters can have their melees miss. They're not parried. Blood decays. I believe Bloodworms have a chance to parry as well, but I generally don't see it. So these are the top logs of every class on Mythic Smolderon. Obviously, no parry here. No parry here for Druids. No parry here for Paladins. And there are some parries, some here, but these are melee misses and not parries. So everything a tank does, because their class is built to be in front of the boss where parries will happen, cannot parry. So every single tank cannot parry on these bosses. And that is because, obviously, imagine if you're playing something like Blood Decay, and you hit Death Strike to heal from 2% health to 100% health because you just took big damage. But because, let's say, the boss parried your Death Strike, you just wouldn't heal, and then you die. That is bad, obviously. So changing this so that they have whitelisted all of their abilities to be unparryable is good. Because for the grand scheme of things, it is important that consistency is key. Now, when you talk about other melee DPS, like rogues, warriors, feral druids, stuff like anything that's not a tank can parry. And here's a prime example of it. This is a clip given to me by Garms in the Skyhold Discord. But here, what you're about to see is the entire class of arms currently is rotated, built, and revolved around this button right here called Colossus Smash. And Colossus Smash amplifies your damage a significant degree, and when Colossus Smash ends, the amount of rage you spent gives you a buff that increases your strength by a percent base. So this button just gives you a large amount of percent damage that you fluctuate through in the fight. But this is what bosses can do. You're about to see the parry. You're about to see this come off cooldown, but Sarkareth, because it needed to target raid members to put mechanics on them, turns around randomly. They have alleviated this through some of the different boss mechanics that they have tried to do, but because Sark doesn't have a cast bar, you can see his Colossus Smash, not applied to the target, has been parried, and now for the next probably 30 seconds, he is doing a significantly reduced amount of damage to the boss because his entire kit and what it was built around just got parried. And that sucks, man. That is terrible. That is bad design. And it begs the question now of, is parry still worth it in World of Warcraft today? Is it worth having this mechanic? Is parry... Because you can look at it a couple ways. Parry is, I would say, is also somewhat seen as a bit of skill expression, where depending on your position to the boss, you're going to do just a little more damage. You're not going to do 5% more damage to the boss, but you're going to do a little more damage by positioning correctly so the boss isn't going to parry you. The boss is no longer parry haste, so that's not a problem, but there's a lot of mechanics and situations that require you to be in front of the boss. And because they think it's unfair, they also think it's unfair that doing the mechanics is a detriment. They have added something interesting. If you see a boss like Rashok, or you see the boss currently in Mythic Smolderon, where he does a big frontal smash in front of him, he is doing it in a channeled ability. While bosses are channeling, they cannot parry you. So there is skill expression in the game. where you can be behind the boss, walk in front, step in for that frontal smash that you need to soak, and then go back behind the boss to reduce as much parry and reduce what you're dealing with more so than anything else. So it does add skill expression to a game. There is technically ways to play around it. The clip I showed you of Sarkareth spinning around and not channeling something, I think it was a mistake on their part, or with how they designed the mechanic and that abilities to apply to players, meaning it wasn't allowed for them, meaning he could parry in those moments, and some of those moments, especially depending on how early you get to these bosses, really matters. Now, do I think parry should be completely removed from the game? Like, is it an antiquated mechanic? Does it no longer deserve to be a part of World of Warcraft? No. I think parry should still be here. I think it's fine if parry is here. I think it adds skill expression. It is very annoying when you get parried because parry, depending on your weapon, actually has in-game a distinct sound effect based on your weapon. If you're using bladed weapons like swords, you will hear a tink. If you're using dual maces, as an example, you'll hear kind of a weird thump. There's actually sound design built around when you're parrying because they also want to give you visual and audio feedback for when you're playing the game they deem incorrectly by being parried, by being positioned wrong on these bosses. They've done this since the beginning of the game. They want you where they want you. I think that is fine. However, through the use of channeled mechanics, it does alleviate that a little bit, but I think more so than anything, what they need to do is certain abilities that are key and primary to the class, like let's say Bloodbath for this tier's current warrior set, let's say Colossus Smash from Arms in its current form. I think abilities that are or that do most, if not all of your damage, or affect all of your damage, those should be whitelisted from parry. I don't think parry should be removed completely, but I do think that those abilities, because of how important they are, because of how impactful they are, should be whitelisted. Should your Mortal Strike be parried? Sure. Should your Colossus Smash? No. Because I think parry, while it is very annoying, still is thematically and importantly gameplay-wise an annoying but in-depth and interesting mechanic in terms of boss design. They have designed other bosses to have constant frontals, as an example. Like take Council of Dreams, where the boss frontals a lot, right? Obviously, you're not going to stand in front of there because you're going to die, not because of parry. But still, it also incentivizes you to not be in front of the bosses. And I think as a design philosophy, they really want that as their design. Would I be sad if they removed parry? No, not at all. I think it would be totally fine. It would be very chill. I wouldn't have any issue with it. I do think that there is an issue. I don't like to talk about PvP, but I think if you remove parry from PvP, it becomes a problem. So I think the only change I would realistically make if I wanted it removed is that PvE bosses and monsters should just no longer parry. That's just how I feel about it. And if they don't remove it, then certain abilities that are major and capstone that do a significant amount of your damage should be whitelisted as to make sure that your class is functioning correctly without having to worry too much. You might get a bit of a damage loss from positioning wrong, but I don't think it should affect your class in such a significant manner as an example of Colossus Smash or potentially Kingsbane being parried, right, from rogues. But that's all I really have to say about parry. It is a staple mechanic. It has been in the game forever. It has been part of real life forever, and I'm really not sure where I want to go with it. I would honestly be happier if it was removed compared to sad, but I do think that they should look at whitelisting certain abilities to make it more consistent, and I think that making those abilities whitelisting would also mean that they can do things in a raid encounter where you can try and optimize being behind the boss, but if you need to be in front of the boss for mechanics or strategies, it's not nearly as big of a deal or potential big of a deal if your main abilities get parried, where mainly your side abilities and spenders would get parried instead. Ugh. I didn't expect to go through a 20-minute video talking about parry, but here we are. Also, I don't remember if I mentioned it because it was probably over 10 minutes ago, but because in Classic, parry hasting was a big deal. Actually, no, I did talk about it. I used the cans, so I don't have to talk about it again. But thank you very much for watching. What do you think? I know some people like it, some people hate it, some people just don't care or pay attention that it exists at all. What do you think about it? I am very curious to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much for watching. I said that so many times. I'm so bad at ending videos. I'm just going to end it. Have a good one. Bye-bye. Fuck me. Oh, man.